Today we are joined by Donald Stinson. Donald is the author of Downstairs at the White House, which is his memoir of his true story of his time as a teenage clerk during the Nixon and Ford administrations. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below and comment your thoughts on the episode or anything you'd like to see me discuss in the future. Enjoy the episode. Your memoir here, Downstairs at the White House, was probably one of the more eccentric and entertaining memoirs I've ever read. It's a unique approach for sure, but as a young person myself, I'm 22 and I'm also very interested and invested in politics and history like yourself when you were a young kid in college. So it really struck a chord with me. I really identified with it. I could sort of put myself in your shoes, and I I plan I, I'm at UCF right now getting my bachelor's in political science, and I want to go to grad school at Georgetown. So I want to go to school in DC, live in DC, so I could sort of put myself in your shoes, um, and live those experiences through you as a young person going to school in DC. But it's almost reading your memoir. It's almost as if you were the Forrest Gump of Washington DC in the 70s.
That's actually very accurate.
I mean, it's like you seem to be at all of the right places at the right time, seeing all these incredibly historic events play out, and you always just seem to find yourself right in the middle of it.
Well, what's funny is it. First of all, it all was an accident. Not one bit of it was planned. Um, I went to college. There was a program back in the early '70s that allowed you to go from high school to college, or from 11th grade to college.
Mm.
And I took advantage of that and ended up in DC at American University studying political science. And I kept trying to get a job on Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't count the number of times I was rejected. In fact, I was rejected before I even got in the door to the office, even from my own congressman. So I was looking for a way to be able to involve myself in and learn something about how all of that worked. And one day I bumped into a guy who lived on the same floor that I did in the dormitories. He had a job in what he said was the old executive office building as a clerk part-time. And he wasn't very interested in it. So he wanted to know if I was. And I said, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going down there. I had no idea what the old executive office building was, except that it was next to the White House. I went in on the 17th Street side, and to tell you the truth, and a lot of people find this hard to believe, but I was 17, and my frontal lobe had not connected at that time, and I didn't know really where I was. So one day I get the job, and one day I'm assigned something very important. That's to clean out somebody's office who had left. And as I'm cleaning out the desk, I open up one of the drawers, and in it is stationery that says the White House, Washington. And I looked at that and I said, my God. So I walked out and I went over to one of the wonderful, they were called secretaries in those days, who was across the hall. And I said, boy, is somebody going to get in trouble? Look at what they have here. And she kind of looked at me, and then she laughed in a very nice way and explained to me that actually I was working in the White House. So that was all part of the complex. So I had it was kind of a dumb start to it. And that dumbness kind of followed me around for the entire time that I was there. And that's how I ended up just bumping into things. My dad gave me some advice before I went to college. And what he said is, Don, try everything and anything. He said, because they can't eat you. And he was absolutely right. So I got away with a lot of stuff that, because I was that age, that I certainly would not have gotten away with if I had been even 25. So, in fact, back in those days, you would have read about them, or your parents might have had. It may have been your grandparents had one. There was a thing called a pet rock.
Yeah, I've
So
heard of them.
okay, so I was kind of like the pet rock, and I was a gopher. I had very very minimal things to do, but I would end up in situations, and I found that my entire life in very odd situations that sometimes scared the living daylights out of me, and other times, provided something that was very very teachable or learnable kind of moment. I started working for a group called the Council on International Economic Policy that was headed by an incredible guy by the name of Peter Flanagan, who was an assistant to the president. Flanagan, as a matter of fact, was a descendant of August Bush, and but he had been a World War II fighter pilot. I mean, incredible guy. Anyway, I did important things like delivered the mail, cleaned out offices, did things like that. Uh, Eventually, I decided that maybe there were some other opportunities. And so one day, and again, it just absolutely unplanned and an accident. I guess maybe there's sometimes advantages to being a little klutzy. So I ended up standing behind a guy at a water fountain in the EOB who was filling up a coffee pot. In those days, you'd fill water into the
Hmm.
pot long before Mr. Coffee came along. And I knocked him over, and the water got all over him and me and the whole bit. Well, we ended up becoming friends, and at least he didn't hit me. And he turned out to be one of Spiro Agnew's speechwriters. And so I thought at that time, you know, working for the vice president, that might be interesting. And because his office was right around the corner from ours, they had the vice presidential seal over the door and the flags in front of it and all of that. And I said, that's just cool. That's just going to be a cool thing to do. So I got a job working on uh, letters primarily that came in from all sorts of different kinds of people who would write to the vice president. He was, for whatever it was worth, he was the most corresponded to at that time, most corresponded to vice president in history. Um, and so there were about 8 or 9 of us that worked answering letters and doing those kinds of things. And then I ran into any number of strange things in that led me on to other things. So my whole life's just been this series of, in many cases, happy accidents.
Mm. But that's what life is, you know. I mean, it's it's sort of your life has reflected the epitome of just seizing opportunity. I mean, that's all we can do on any given day is seize the opportunities that life gives to us. The older I get and the more people I meet, especially young people, you know, a lot of young people I like to go to conferences and talk with fellow intelligent young people, and I've never met anyone who's had it all figured out. I realize this as I get older. You know, you may see people and they present themselves super well and they say they're going to do this and they're going to do that. But at the end of the day, no one really knows what they're doing. And that's sort of a something I've noticed as I've gotten older and talked to more people, and sort of a reassuring fact. You know, a lot of times, especially especially if you have political ambitions, seeing other people, you know, doing cool things, meeting cool people, it can be a little not intimidating, but you can feel a little bit of FOMO. Sometimes you can feel a little bit of imposter syndrome, but I think reminding yourself of the fact that no one's got it figured out, just seize the opportunity that life gives you, and your life embodied that. But I want to go back to something that you said early on. The fact that you got rejected over and over again. Um, so I do want to linger a little bit on rejection. Sort of,
I know a lot about it.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, talking from my own experiences, I would love to work for for congressmen and internships and that thing. And I've had a couple interviews and I haven't got any. I mean, how did you cope and handle with that rejection? Were you beat down by it, or did you kind of pick yourself up by the bootstraps, say, okay, I messed up here, let me improve upon this or get better here? How did you face that rejection?
I think I dealt with it the same way most people do. There were times when it would really get me down. Sometimes it would be, the circumstances would be funny, and other times people would say something nice that would just keep me going. It was a mixture of those kinds of things. But the major thing was I didn't have any idea what I was doing or what kind of job I was actually looking for. Just I was going to work as a volunteer, and they didn't want me. But I will say this: most people are very nice particularly to young folks who are have no clue, and they'll try to give you a little coaching. And several people did that ended up helping with the rejection issues. But I had been in door-to-door sales for several summers before I ended up in Washington and selling newspaper subscriptions door to door in the country in Alpharetta, Georgia. And that was the height of rejection. So I was used to it by that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it was my father or someone else who was very learned who made the comment, so what? So they rejected. The next person may say yes. Yeah. And, eventually things just worked out so that would occur. You just have to keep plugging away at it. That's it.
Exactly. It's all about persistence. I truly do believe, sort of in the cosmic, almost theological sense, that if you truly try your best and you truly never give up, it is impossible to fail. In the long run, you will succeed if you simply never give up and continue to try your best. You will be rewarded. It's almost statistically impossible, I believe, that failing is a certainty.
Most people, I think you'll find, are not very good at what they do. They don't put the time in. They don't have the dedication, and as a result, they do sit around and wonder why they didn't get promoted or one thing or another. And that's usually most of it. It really, of course, the time that you're in now and at your age is a little bit different than when I was young. Mm-hmm. Because we had come off of, my father's generation was, the greatest generation in World War II, and the work ethic and the whole bit. So, it was a matter of what can you do to distinguish yourself from other people, mm-hmm. Who are either afraid or are just not particularly motivated. And over my career, which lasted a lot longer than the White House did, thank God, what I learned was that there were a couple of things. Number one is that, at least in those days, you were the first one in the office and the last one out. Number two, public speaking and having to be able to command an audience is worth its weight in absolute gold, because most people, and I think probably because in listening to you, and you're taking a leap to have a podcast, I'm sure you're very good at it, and that'll serve you better than you'll ever think. And I think the other thing is having an intellectual curiosity, is asking a lot of questions to learn about, just about anything, and reading a lot. I had we had a very close family friend who was the editor of the Miami News in Florida. He was a kid who grew up ill, and growing up, I guess in the late 20s and early 30s, and he all he could do was read. That he was bedridden, and he never went to college, but he ended up becoming not only a an editor of Encyclopedia Britannica, and one of the best known editors in the country. He was one of the very first, along with another family friend who led in integration in the South as early as the 1950s. But he was also nominated, I believe, I have to look it up because when they provide the information, but was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh,
And
wow.
so what he did is he is hammered on me every time he saw me in a very nice way because I was just a little boy, but about reading and doing that all the time, and I still do that to this day. So there's a long talk from an old guy, but those are the things I found that works
No,
the best.
that is no that's wonderful advice. That's I don't claim to know anything or be an expert on anything, but the advice I always like to give is to be curious. I think that is by far the most important thing, especially as a young person, is to be curious about the world around you. Like you said, ask those questions. But reading truly is a superpower. And going back to what you said earlier about sort of the difference in your generation versus mine, in some ways, um, I think we have it a lot harder. But in a lot of ways, I think we have it a lot easier because there's a lot more uh how do I phrase this? There's a lot more sort of distractions. That's the word I'll use. There's a lot more distractions that young people face today, especially with social media. It's so easy to um not be ambitious and to be comfortable. We're getting these dopamine addictions from everywhere around us. We have this phone in our pocket that has endless entertainment and comfort and satisfaction, and it's really difficult to get over that hump and have goals and strive for dreams and work hard when you're constantly inundated with comfort. So in that way, we have it in that way we have it a lot harder. But on the opposite side of that same coin, we have it a lot easier because in a way that this may sound kind of ruthless, but the competition is way less. I mean, back in your day, everyone was sort of on the same. I don't know. This isn't true, but everyone was sort of on the same playing field. You didn't have the social media and the distractions. You had to go out there and talk to people. That was the only way you could do anything or communicate and move up in the world. But now there's so many distractions around us that young people especially get so caught up in that if you really are focused and you want to do something and you can put those distractions to the side, the competition is a lot less.
Yeah, I think it's always been a lot less. The 80-20 rule, familiar with that?
Yeah,
I
refresh me because I've heard of it, but I
80-20 rule is, for example, 80% of whatever problem you have lies in 20% of the people that work for you. It, I have, since the first time I learned that, I've used that as a gauge for trying to approach problems. And it is very, very true, almost universally true. So it gives you a way to be able to get a leg up on your competition because you will have learned some ways to be able to approach problems and get to the answers much faster. Most people are just kind of flopping around
Mhm.
and trying to make issues go away when if you understand certain things about business and the thing is politics, business, medicine, in many ways, they all operate the same way. So most of the rules still apply.
That yeah, that's wonderful. You touch on something that is very important to me. You said people are flopping around, and that's almost a more eloquent way of saying, kind of what I was trying to get at. Many people go through life going through the motions because they're inundated with so many avenues of comfort that they sort of flop around through life. And my favorite word is intentionality. If you live your life intentionally, and you do everything intentionally, you make conscious decisions. You think about what you want to do. You make decisions instead of just going through the motions of life. That sort of um is basically what I'm trying to say. Um but as you look back on your life, you had this wonderful experience as a young person. When did you decide that you wanted to write this memoir? Where did that
Well,
where
what's funny, a lot of people said, why did it take you, almost 45 years to write the book? And the only answer I had was, gee, I'm a slow writer. But um, the truth was, I just needed some time. And I had a almost 30-year career, well, more than 30 years in the newspaper industry. And then I semi-retired to do some consulting work. And finally, I got to the point where in 2016, when I had time to be able to sit down and devote myself full time to it, because writing a book, as most folks will tell you, it's easy to write a really bad one, but it's
Yeah,
hard to write one that people actually want to read.
right.
And so that's why it took a long time, and it was just a matter of time and then gathering thoughts. Luckily, I took some notes back
Mm,
in those days about things that happened, and the dumber, the sillier they were, I thought the better. And I would use those stories. I was in sales, although I ended up thankfully at the top of the food chain, but I was in sales most all of my life. And so being able to inject a lot of those kinds of stories and other things, again, it was something that, gave me a way to separate myself from other people because it was
yeah.
curious. It was a curiosity.
That's interesting. So you were writing notes when you were going through all of this. Did you periodically go back and look through your notes, or did you only open up this treasure trove of notes once you decided you want to write the book? What was that experience like, to go back and read your own notes from many years prior? Were you
That
uh
is a that is a great question. No one's ever asked me that. It um,
were you sort of embarrassed by what you wrote? Were you impressed with yourself as a young person?
well, I had lost the embarrassment. One of the advantages of age is that you care a lot less what anybody thinks of you. And and although it was, some of the stuff was odd in the way that I perceived things. Um, I had a very naive
Yeah.
view of most things. And particularly as they applied to the people that I was dealing with, who in many cases were very powerful people. Um, so it was interesting. It brought back just floods of memories, and thankfully, mostly good memories. But I could look at that and say, boy, I was not exactly a brain surgeon back in those days. So
Yeah, that's funny that on the question of naivete, um one of my favorite quotes that I tried to live by, I believe is from Socrates here. And I I I I realize this is true. The older I get, I'm still so young, so I 100% am still naive, but I try to do the best I can to, you know, become smarter, I guess. But I think it's Socrates. He says the only true wisdom is in knowing that you know nothing. Almost the more you learn, the more you know nothing.
Jake, that's absolutely correct. And it's true virtually at any age. And people that stop learning, it's a terrible shame. Um, you're on a curve your whole life, and all of a sudden,
Yeah.
what I found interesting, at least what happened to me, is I would start to come to understand things in chunks.
Yes.
It were, not just one little piece at a time, but a whole bunch of pieces at one time. By the way, I'll throw in one other thing since we're talking about it, about things that are a great asset, is math.
Really?
Most people can't do math. I found, of course, in the business I was in, which was newspaper advertising, the ability to do math, to be able to do algebra, sometimes even, just on the edges of calculus, helped me get through things very quickly and help establish what a good reputation for being able to get those kinds of things done. But math is another thing that'll separate you from people.
That's interesting because growing up in school, everyone always, during math is probably the least popular subject that people don't like learning about. And the question always was in math class, why do I need to know this? What's the relevance to the real world? I'm never going to use this in the real world, but you're rejecting that premise.
Yes. The Now there was a lot of stuff that we did in school that I never used. I learned one thing though, it's a simple ratio. I'll email it to you.
Okay.
Uh, a simple ratio that I learned in 8th grade science that I still use today to be able to determine the right proportions of things. And I'll try to explain that in the note to you, but it takes like seconds to be able to understand where you're headed with a particular problem, and some other things. And I always thank that 8th grade teacher who had no idea they were helping me along that much,
Right.
for that simple formula.
Well, for the audience, what exactly is this ratio?
Well, what it is, I guess I would put it this way: 1,000 is to 100 as X is to 200. You multiply the two numbers that are on the inside and divide by the numbers on the outside, and you will get the correct answer. That, as silly as it sounds, that just cuts through a lot of stuff. If you understand what mathematical ratios are, it would help me determine things like how much a project that how much money a project might make, um, based on as many things as possible being equal. That it should turn out X amount of revenue based on past performance of other programs. So without having to sit down at a computer and do all this, all it took was a piece of paper and a calculator.
Interesting. So 1,000 to 100 would be um, sort of a previous endeavor or enterprise, and then uh, X to 200 or whatever you said would be the current enterprise that you're looking and sort of comparing it to the last one.
Yeah, you could
Okay.
use it for that. You could use it for a lot of different things. Um, if I walked 10 miles in 30 minutes, how many miles should I be able to walk in an hour?
Okay. Interesting. I see what you're saying.
That
Huh.
kind of thing. I mean, it's so simple, but
Right.
you'll find it to be an asset.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Um, so let's go to your college experience. One of the things I'm very fascinated by is culture, and I'm a really old soul. I believe I was born in the wrong time. I wish I lived through your era. I wish I was my age during the 80s. But young people during this time period that you grew up in were quite active. There was a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War, especially on college campuses. It was sort of a hotbed for counterculture, rejection of establishment. Um, so as a young person on campus during all these sort of protests in the Vietnam War, you were there. You had a firsthand seat to watch this. So what was that experience like? What was your kind of thoughts on the counterculture revolution?
Yeah, very, very mixed. Um, so I was the guy on campus when there were demonstrations, and actually by the time the fall of 1972 came around, there were not the number of college demonstrations that there had been in from, let's say, 67 to 1970 or 71.
Right.
Um, but I was the odd duck out because I I was going to work mostly. I mean, I went to school full time and I worked virtually full time. I was the one going to the Nixon White House, so
Yeah.
I didn't participate in those things.
Sure.
Um, but that it was a very stressful time. Uh, I sat with a friend who was older who watched on television to see if his draft number came up in the lottery, and it did. And so there was no one that I knew who was anxious to go. The other thing was that it was a kind of a shock to us, maybe less for my parents' generation and even my grandparents because of the two world wars. But we hadn't been even touched remotely by death in war, most of us, as kids, 12, 13 years old. And I can remember very well in high school, and the principal would come to the door of the class, happened a couple of times, and they'd pull one of the students out, and his parents would be out there, and they'd let them know that their brother had died in Vietnam. And it was it was a tense time, but it was not. While it was openly discussed, you wouldn't find a lot of people who would necessarily disagree with the fact that we shouldn't be there or
Yeah,
that we shouldn't have been there.
for sure. Yeah.
Um, and that is something else that I can recommend that is to read about Robert McNamara, who
Mhm.
was the Secretary of Defense, and read about Johnson, President Johnson in those days. I have a piece that's in the book that's about Vietnam. It talks about the Gulf of Tonkin and several of the things that we allowed to have happen or purposely misread in order to escalate the war.
Yeah.
And that began a problem that became known as the credibility gap,
Yeah.
where people started to that not to believe the government, that and the fact that you could see it at night on Walter Cronkite and actually see war was a very different experience than listening to my dad talk about the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, that's a great point. And my last episode I did, we talked about the Vietnam War, and one of the interesting things we talked about is that the Vietnam War was the first television war. In World War II, in World War II, you had these sort of government-sponsored newsreels. You're just reading kind of what the government approves in the media, very pro-patriotic, buy our war bonds, support the war effort, um, sort of really propaganda. But in Vietnam, you have news journalists with television cameras who are there, and you're seeing the death and the bloodshed. And also, it's sort of an unpopular war. We're not achieving our objectives as fast as the American people would like. We're seeing sustained brutality over long periods of time without any sort of real tangible gain or benefit. And it really drove a lot of people away and created, like you said, that credibility gap, which,
Yeah, happened. I happened to. I had left employment at the White House, but I happened to be there visiting some friends on the day uh, that we left Saigon,
oh, wow.
and to see the looks on the faces of my friends who they had only touched it remotely in most cases. It was a horrible thing for everyone. The fact that we lost um, paled in comparison to what was happening to the people in Saigon at the
Hmm.
time. But we didn't leave them behind, and and did our best to get them out. But that was a huge shock to the system, for the country, although it was welcome.
Yeah, this is basically what we talked about last episode. The conclusion of the Vietnam War, um, sort of the epitome of Kissinger's realpolitik, um, making making choosing the less bad option, basically, um, and the decision to get out of Vietnam. I mean, the American public was so tired of it. My last guest, Keith Saliba, he's basically saying by the end of the Vietnam War, the policies were working, but everyone was so tired of the war, and Nixon had promised that we were going to get out of the war, that Nixon didn't really care. All he cared about was finishing the war, by whatever means necessary. And between him and Kissinger, their talks were, as long as Saigon doesn't fall right after our withdrawal, they can sleep at night. So if they fall a month later, it's pretty bad. But if they fall, and I believe Saigon fell after the Paris Peace Accords. I believe it fell like 2 years later. So
It was very fast. It did not take a long time.
yeah, it's a shame. But I mean, going back to the young people, and you're being the oddball out. I mean, that was especially true because you worked for Nixon. Um, most young people at that time were pretty anti-Nixon, and you were working for him. So did you ever run into people, maybe some girls, and you're talking to these girls, having a good time, and then you're like, oh, yeah, I work at the White House or whatever, and they're just like, oh, and you see that attitude shift.
It happens all the time. Mentioning that you worked for Nixon could get you a brick in the back of the head. No, I became pretty unpopular in a lot of corners pretty quickly, but that was okay. I mean, and as it turned into Watergate, then just that got work. How could you work for a crook like that, and all of those kinds of things? And the answer is, he was the president. I had no policy role. Okay, I delivered
Right.
mail and
Yeah.
other things, and so but nevertheless, it may have been my just too much of my charming personality for them, and they couldn't stand it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They realized that you were out of their league, so they had
Yeah,
to
right.
they
Yeah,
had to cope
actually,
with.
I had the worst time. I ended up, because of volunteer work I had done, I ended up with tickets, a friend of mine and I, to the inaugural youth balls. And it was hell to try to get a date. It finally happened that I got a date because I ran into a girl physically uh, in the campus hub,
Yeah,
and she agreed to go. But most people rejected me pretty quickly.
that's funny. Yeah, you sort of have to change your approach, uh, and omit those damning details when you're talking to the ladies. But so you're working in the EOB. You talked about the moment you realized you work for the White House. How did it feel to be in a historic building like that? Because it's big shoes to fill. I mean, you're standing on the shoulders of giants of American history who walked those same halls, worked in those same rooms. I mean, so many great historical figures, so much history there. And now you're delivering mail. You're an intern here. Does the what did that sort of feel like?
Well, first of all, I wasn't an intern. Um, Interns in those days were rich kids whose parents gave a lot of money to Nixon's campaign. I was actually a government employee,
Mm,
um, which meant I didn't get any of the spoils that they did. I had to get mine, through
yeah,
different means.
Yeah, you actually had a job to do.
Yeah, I did. And um, the more time that I spent there, and then as I started to go into the White House proper, the West Wing, of course, I ended up working in the East Wing for a long period of time, relatively. You know, you sort of overcome it by the history. That's History has always been one of my favorite topics, and you think about the fact that I know I am walking down the same hallway that Winston Churchill walked down. I am at the door to the office where Franklin Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy. Um, the A friend of mine's, a secretary who was a friend of mine, the entrance to her area was where the Japanese had come in on December 7th, 1941, to express that they had no interest in war. The diplomats came over, while at the same time, minutes afterward, they started bombing Pearl Harbor. And so, you try to take that in and go, I have to be the luckiest person in the world to be able to stand here in this space. Um, the I mean, and there were great stories when you could find the right people who were also historians about. There was one about Blackjack Pershing riding his horse down this. I guess obviously up the stairs. We had these beautiful winding stairs, and very wide staircases, and riding his horse up and then riding it back down again. So there were there were scandals that had gone on at various points, and so but at the end of the day, whether it was in the EOB, which really it didn't really make that much difference, but inside the White House itself,
Yeah.
it was just like working anywhere else. You
Right.
know, there were people spread rumors and people got in arguments and machinery broke down and all of those kinds of things. Um, but the I, it, I was involved and every time it would come up about Vice President Harris being in what I guess is now the ceremonial office, the Vice President's office. Um, I think about the number of times that I was down there, um, and to realize, and I think at that time that had been Franklin Roosevelt's office. Um, so it's interesting as things come up in the news and they talk about certain um, features of the building or rooms that make me laugh. I used to hide out, kind of, sort of, behind a chair outside the Roosevelt room, which is right across from the Oval Office,
Hmm.
and there there were always these two Secret Service agents who looked like they were tackles for Ohio State, and I mean they covered the door, and eventually they'd throw me out, but I get to hang out there a while and watch who went in and came back out. That was fun. That was
Yeah.
interesting.
No, that's incredible. I've actually had the privilege of touring the White House, so I have been inside the White House. So I could sort of I could make out when you're writing in your book about the certain rooms and staircases, I knew what you were talking about, and it's pretty impossible to put into words that feeling of standing on the shoulders of giants. It's almost like you're in this reverent space. I can't put it into words, but it's a magical experience. And to be working there, I mean, you had plenty. There's plenty of stories, um, like you said, the Japanese coming through to say they don't want war as the Japanese Zeros are flying towards Pearl Harbor. Um, But another interesting thing, I had on Matthew Costello from the White House Historical Association, and we were talking about the history of the White House, and something that he brought up that I'd never thought about was the paranormal activity of the White House, and this was something that you touched on in the book, and I was blown away. But did you ever encounter any paranormal activity?
I didn't, but and it's among you're right, it's among the stories in the book. There was a I got to know the House staff very well, and many of those people had been there forever. A lot of them had been there uh, when FDR was president, and a large number were hired when Harry Truman was president. Uh, so there were interesting kinds of stories about things that had happened. This one woman who had been hired, and she worked in the laundry. Um, Absolutely lovely lady. She was a church going woman, and as honest as the day is long.
Hmm.
She had a story, and she wouldn't follow up on it a lot. But if you got to know her, she'd tell you the story. That she walked into the Lincoln bedroom, which had been his office, that space, because of the White House having been essentially having been gutted back during the Truman administration to be rebuilt because it was so dangerous. That she saw Lincoln sitting on the bed, pulling on his boots, and she screamed and ran out of there. There was a case, and so I always said, that was a woman that was not going to make things up. There were also a couple of administrations, including, if I remember correctly from what I wrote, during the Clinton administration, there were some people who refused to go into that room because it gave them the willies. Um, I had been in it, and I never felt anything like that. But the White House was known to be haunted by the spirit of David Burns, who is the guy who sold the property that the White House sits on to the government originally, and a British soldier, infantryman, and a couple of others that are of no particular historical note. There is one I can tell you that I think I came across. It had to do with Dolly Madison.
Oh wow.
And now people would say that in the East Room that some of the staff that worked at night, there were claims, that they may have seen her hanging her laundry. That's what when and she was preceded where she went with the smell of lilacs. And I remember being out in the Rose Garden area where there were, to my recollection, in that there were no lilacs, but there was a very strong scent of them at some point, and somebody going, well, Dolly Madison must be here. There's another story about her, so maybe I touched that. But there are more interesting stories across the street in Lafayette Park. There's a house. It's called the New Orleans House. It's at it's on G Street. If you walked out of the east wing of the White House and went up towards Vermont Avenue, you would run right into it at the corner. I think I have my streets right. Where she appeared. She was dead, and her spirit sat in a rocking chair and would wave to people who went by. Now, the thing is that this was actually reported in newspapers at the time. So and people found it a little disconcerting, but it wasn't as big a deal. If you read the reports of it, which I did at one point, it it gives you the impression that well, yeah, her ghost is probably around there, but people don't think it's that big a deal. But she can be a little aggravating.
Yeah.
Um, there were there were any number of different kinds of stories of those things, but I never. Maybe Dolly Madison was the closest one I came to, and that may not have been that at all. So I don't know. Uh, but there's a great story at the Octagon House, which is a few blocks away, where the Madisons had to go during the War of 1812 when the White House was burned.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of spooky stuff was reported there. And then also in the Decatur House, which is now used by the White House Historical Association. But there are tours of the house. And Stephen Decatur died there. And the story is that his visage would come up to the windows over periods of time and freak people out. And so you see these windows that are blocked, that are bricked in, which someone once explained to me that had nothing to do with a ghost. It has to do with heating and other kinds of things.
Right.
But it's a great story.
Wow.
So as a friend of mine once said, never let truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
But a lot of entertaining stuff.
No, Dolly Madison's a fascinating one. She's someone who I think more people should know about what she did um, during the War of 1812 when the British were burning down Washington and particularly the White House. In the East Room, they have Washington's portrait hung, big giant portrait of him standing there like a gentleman. And during the War of 1812, when the British were closing in and burning down DC, Dolly Madison was still in the White House. She had just made dinner and she was notified that the British were coming. And in very courageous fashion, decided to stick around to save the portrait of President Washington, so that it wouldn't be burned or desecrated by the British. And it was bolted into the wall. They had to unscrew all these screws and bolts, and they ended up saving it. And now it's on display again in the East Room. But I mean, that act alone, I think should be taught about in mainstream schooling of American history. I think that's incredibly important because the symbolism of it. I mean, can you imagine the British desecrating the portrait of the father of our country? It's more than just a painting. Like the symbolism of that would have been profound.
Absolutely. She had a lot of guts.
Yeah.
You find that with a lot of first ladies who had, even if they were quiet, they had a lot of moxie.
Yeah.
Uh, so I agree with you. That would be an important thing to teach. That one funny thing to just throw in is I've spent a lot of time in England, and the one of the interesting things is I went to give a speech, and I made some comment about sorry about that little conflict we had, some quip in 1776,
Yeah.
and nobody knew what I was talking about. It's not taught really in British schools.
Really?
No, it's like almost like it never happened. I mean, obviously a big deal to us, but they lost, so
Yeah.
they're not interested in talking about it.
Wow.
I found that an interesting thing.
That is incredible. I didn't know that. I mean, I guess
I don't know if that's
yeah.
everywhere, or the people I was talking to just they missed that part of class.
Yeah.
But no, they didn't really know much about it at
I
all.
guess history is taught by the victors. That's what they say.
Yeah, indeed.
Huh. Let's talk about the Oval Office. This was the culmination of specialty in the White House is the Oval Office. So I believe so. You visited the Oval Office while you were still working in the EOB. You'd made friends with the security guard who took a liking to you, I guess. And then one day he gets to show you the Oval Office. And I was watching there was a video the other day after the inauguration of Trump where JD Vance walked into the White House, or not, no, the Oval Office for the very first time as vice president. He'd never been in the Oval Office. Now he's vice president. Walks into the Oval Office, and Speaker Johnson was recording him, and he walks in to the Oval Office. He just looks around, and he's like, "Wow," he's just looking around like, "Wow." And I think it was him who said this, but afterwards he was like, "I wish I had something really profound and cool to say, but I was speechless." So my question is this: now that you've had many years to look back and reflect on your experiences, especially being in the Oval Office, you've taken many showers where you have those shower thoughts of regret where I wish I would have said this in this altercation or experience. Um, what do you wish you said? What was, first of all, what was the experience like of being in the Oval Office? And what do you wish you said when in hindsight?
Well, the first time I went, and there's a funny lead up to that in the book. But my impression is that it had different air. Somehow there was more oxygen, or a higher amount of oxygen in that room. And I don't know if that was a physiological reaction that I had, or it's actually true. But it is, for someone who is a history nut, it's absolutely overwhelming. I do remember quite well the first time having these visions of FDR sitting in there, and Truman and Ike, and it was incredible. In fact, one of my friends, very good friend of mine, who had come to the White House with Ike, after Ike, after he was president of Columbia University and then been elected president, took me. He took me to it showed me where they still had a collection of wood panels in the Oval Office floor that had been removed because Ike used to wear his golf shoes in there and put holes in it. But it's too much history all at once.
Yeah.
It really makes your head spin. And I would go there anytime I had an opportunity to. Funny thing, in those days, security oddly was not what it is even close to today. And I remember some friends of mine who, from high school actually, who had come up to Washington. They were, I don't know, going to travel the country or whatever, backpacking. And I brought them in to show them the Oval Office, and they just brought their stuff with them. Nobody asked to look at it. In fact, no one ever asked to look at my briefcase, which carried my school papers and things like that when I went in. But, you talk about stories about things that have a lesson in them. One thing I don't want to forget to mention, and I think that if folks who are interested in the book, what I think would find interesting, and what I tried to write was a mix of humor about being a kid around these people and history, both what was contemporary history about Watergate, and then and things and events that had occurred in the White House that I had become familiar with, either firsthand or secondhand or from books. And it has to do with the conversation I had with President Nixon. I had one conversation with him. And I still, to this day, particularly looking back, is that actually we weren't having a conversation. He was having a conversation. And I just happened to be the only thing with a pulse that was nearby. What I used to do, which is how I stumbled into all these things, is I would come in the morning, and I would come up or go down through West Executive Avenue, and I would go into the entrance um, in the basement, walk up the stairs, and then go through um, uh, the Rose Garden area to the mansion, walk through the mansion, and then go to the
Mm-hmm.
East Wing. Sometimes, if I timed it just right, I could at least say, "Good morning, Mr. President," and that would make my
Yeah.
whole day. Well, this one day, I had a book, and whatever it was on the outside, it said something about Theodore Roosevelt, and he and I guess there were two agents with him or whatever, and they're walking and the whole thing. And all of a sudden he looks at this. And this was like April of 1974. So it wasn't that long before it all came to an end. And he stopped and he said, what are you reading? And I said, well, Mr. President, I'm reading about President Roosevelt and whatever the particular topic was. And he started into a conversation. Again, I think he was a whatever they want to say about him. He was a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant, and I felt it. Being close to him, you could feel the brilliance. But what he said was particularly interesting. He talked first about Roosevelt, and he spoke about the fact that Roosevelt was a particularly good president because one of the things that he had done was he had written extensively about American history. And he did. His collection, which I got through part of, about the West, about the conquering of the West, is absolutely incredible. And so he had an understanding about conservation. He had an understanding about the native tribes. He had a great understanding about everything that had occurred up until his time. Then he started talking about Winston Churchill, and he said the interesting thing was that Churchill had done the same thing.
Yeah.
And his volumes on the history of the English-speaking peoples, which that was hard to get through, but I did get through it. Again, it gives you an entirely different view of everything, and so you look back at a lot of our more intellectual presidents, not necessarily the best, but certainly very smart. Were people who read a great deal of American history, wrote about it, and had an appreciation for actually who the people who live in this country are and were. And so it was a great lesson that I learned. What I walked away with was that you can learn more by writing about something, and the work that goes into it, the reading that goes into it to be able to write about it, than you can just simply by reading. So, but that was a transfixing experience. So, and I treasure that. And just in case people are interested, my opinion is that he had been made into a cartoon character, and that he was very stiff and formal, and he sort of was. And I've known a lot of people like that over the years. But my God, he could be extremely charming. He certainly was that day, and just kept talking and talking. I mean, it must have gone. I don't know how long it went on because my knees were shaking. When you're standing next to the guy who can, push a button and destroy the earth, it sort of gets your attention. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with other presidents, but there was anything like Nixon. So I learned a lesson that day that was valuable.
That's wow. That is incredible. I do admire uh President Nixon very much. I think he has been unjustly portrayed by history because of Watergate. I do also think he was a brilliant man, a brilliant politician, a great statesman. But that must have been as a young kid working at the White House talking to the president of the United States, and not it didn't just seem like small talk. Like that was a profound conversation. That was a
It was.
deep
And
that was
I think the only thing I said after explaining the book was, "Thank you, sir." I was just listening, but there, the viewpoints, how he arrived, you could get a kind of a sense. I think I could, um, of how he came about decision making, because he drew on wide arrays of information, and he he was electric. And in fact, I wrote it was talking to him was like punching the accelerator on a Lamborghini. I mean, you just went off. That was a whole different world. And, and I've had some, like I said, some remarkable conversations with other presidents, President Carter, um, who was able to remember details about a community that I lived in Northwest Georgia when he had been governor. I mean, this guy had been he'd been the leader of the free world, but he could remember who was related to who in Floyd County, Georgia. That was you had some absolutely remarkable minds.
yeah, when you meet people like that and you see sort of the traits and qualities they have, you can see I can see why guy became president. I mean, they're operating on another level. But Nixon and Roosevelt's interesting. I know Nixon greatly admired Teddy Roosevelt. Um, in fact, Nixon loved this speech. It was one of his favorite speeches, and it's also my favorite presidential speech of all time. It's called "The Man in the Arena." You're familiar with it? It is a very short speech, but it is one of the most profound, powerful things I think I've ever read. Um, and campaigning for president, Nixon, who understood the importance of television in presidential campaigning, um, created a new system, not a new system, but a new sort of tactic to ride the wave of television and benefit from that. And now today we know it as the town hall. But back in the day, Nixon was the first, he was the one who pioneered this. He was the first one to do it, and he called it the man in the arena because of Teddy Roosevelt's speech. Because if you look at sort of the structure of it, you sort of yourself are the man in the arena surrounded by people who are asking you questions. Um, so the relationship between Nixon and Teddy is brilliant. I think they're both brilliant, great men, to be frank. But let's linger on Nixon because I actually one sec. One of the things, the main thing I asked for Christmas this past year was President Nixon's memoirs. So I have here the original Nixon memoirs that were released in what it must have been the 80s. So they're the original releases, and it's still wrapped in the plastic. And I'm afraid to open them because I don't want to, break the seal on these, but I also want to read them. But I mean, Nixon was such a fascinating guy, so enigmatic, so brilliant, yet so complicated, and was the president during some of the most transformative, influential, impactful events in American history. And I've really been getting into memoirs recently, especially, you want to understand when we study history from a casual perspective, we look at sort of the overarching event, its significance, its impact, the causes and effects. But something that I've really been trying to focus on recently is reading memoirs of people who are making decisions during those times, or who are directly involved, and understanding their perspective. So I have the Nixon memoirs here. I must say, the Truman memoirs are also at the top of my list. I mean, he made two of the most important decisions in American history, I think, in dropping the atomic bomb and then not dropping it during Korea when he was lobbied to do so. Um, But let's linger on Nixon a little bit. I guess we'll go to Watergate. So, like you said, well, no, before we get to Watergate, I want to talk a little bit about Nixon's achievements. So you worked in the Nixon White House, and from what I understand, people who work in the White House of administrations tend to be very loyal to that president. Would you say that's true?
Oh, absolutely.
So I think Nixon was a great president. I think he made a lot of amazing achievements. How would you characterize the Nixon presidency? Sort of a broad question, but we'll start there.
Uh, he was the last of the New Deal presidents, the last of FDR's generation. The thing that people forget, what gets lost in all of the Watergate and Vietnam, is he founded the EPA.
Mm-hmm.
You know that he wanted to he wanted to build a national healthcare system. He started the first uh, organized attack on cancer. Uh, he did a lot of things that Republican presidents later on shied away from because they. I think what Nixon believed was the capability of government to do a lot of very good things if they were clearly identified and they were pursued with great vigor.
Mm.
Um, so in some ways, some people have argued he was sort of more of a Democrat in some ways, which, by the way, in those days, there wasn't a lot of difference.
Yeah,
there,
no.
there really wasn't much difference. Um, he also had, while he trusted some people he probably shouldn't have, he did have a coterie of people that worked for him who were stunningly brilliant at various levels. An array of them that came from all sorts of different backgrounds. Oh, another thing, which sounds like nothing today, but was a huge deal when it happened. And a friend of mine who I'd worked with on Vice President Agnew's staff went to work for Jill Ruckelshaus. Bill Ruckelshaus was the Assistant Attorney General of the United States who resigned along with Elliot Richardson during the Saturday Night Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they founded the first White House office on women. And again, you have to realize the difference in the times. That was very forward looking. That I don't know what Nixon's particular view was on it. Obviously, Ford was pushed to be in favor of it was the Equal Rights Amendment. But there was a lot that went on that it is lost now, probably to just the serious historians. But he had I think among presidents since Roosevelt, and just my opinion for what it's worth, which may not be very much, but he had the clearest vision about America and perhaps where it should go. I mean, and it's one of the things. Anytime that you examine anyone, you're going to find things that you don't like about them, or things that they said that you don't agree with, or actions they took. But I think if you step back quite a bit from Nixon, I think you see more good
Mm-hmm.
in many ways than you see bad. It may in some areas be a close call, but um, but he had a clear, certainly with Russia and China, he had very, very clear views. I can tell you that my interaction, I also spent time in Russia, that the Russians I met with, and they were all, tertiary level or below, but they had great respect for him. They also expressed that they had fear of him, that they had more fear of him than they did of Reagan.
Really?
Which I found very interesting. But then again, that's a series of opinions from, they were Russian newspaper people, and Russians' newspapers weren't exactly the most open things.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Yeah, I think he 100% doesn't get enough credit for his accomplishments. Watergate completely tainted his legacy, and I hope to be a small part in the movement to change that. But especially in terms of his foreign policy, I mean, his accomplishments were astounding. Vietnam was we lost the Vietnam War, but that really wasn't his fault. It was Johnson who escalated the war. But particularly with China, I think the opening of China was absolutely brilliant. And I consider myself a conservative, and a lot of conservatives that I talk to about this disagree with me. Conservatives tend to be anti-China, but I really do. I will die on that hill because Nixon was the only guy who could have got that done. And speaking to that vision, the vision was absolutely. I mean, his vision was astounding because when he opened China, he said he envisioned this, and it came true as he said it would. He said, in 50 years we're going to be adversaries, so we at least need to be able to talk to each other. And he was the man, and he was absolutely right. I mean, China is an adversary now. Can you imagine if we didn't even have a sort of diplomatic relationship, if we were actual, not talking to each other, hostile? But he was the only man who could have got that done because of his previous record of anti-communism, especially as a Republican, because Republicans were very anti-communist at that time. And if he didn't have that record of being so anti-communist from his time in Congress and the Senate and as vice president, he would have gotten completely vilified and wouldn't have been able to get it done. And then, I mean, the masterful chess move of playing Russia and China off each other. Because can you imagine how powerful communism would have been if China and the Soviet Union, which I think are the two biggest countries in the world, who were both communists at that time, would have been allied? That would have been very dangerous. But in doing so, he became closer with China than the Soviet Union was. So it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And ultimately, I think that led to the downfall of communism at the end of the 20th century and the end of the Cold War in a way, because it really weakened the USSR.
In popular culture, there is there's a line about Nixon that was used, and anybody who noticed it, it's much bigger than they think. In one of the Star Trek movies that was made in the 80s, Mr. Spock says to somebody, only Nixon could have gone to China. And it was a perfect line at that moment, and a perfect line in terms of understanding that sometimes the only way to make a friend is to have been their adversary. So I always thought that was a brilliant thing. But I think we have a lot. We have a lot that we owe him. The same thing with President Ford in keeping the ship afloat. And I have personal, very strong regards about Ford as a very good and decent man. But I don't think as many. I mean, every president he or she dealt certain cards, and but I think Nixon probably played the hand that he had better and farther than most presidents have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, yeah, his vision. I think that's got to be one of the most important characteristics to have as president of the United States. You have to have a vision of where the country's going, and he certainly did have a vision and implemented it until Watergate got in his way and the House of Cards came down. Um, let's get into Watergate now. And I will like to get into Ford later because I share that sentiment of Ford being a great man. I think he's one of those presidents who made one of the most important decisions in American history in pardoning Nixon. Um, but in terms of Watergate, when did you start to see the inklings of this, rise to the surface? Because it had been going on for a long time, sort of behind the scenes. It wasn't really a big deal. This happened during the '72 campaign, and this only started to really come about in '74. When working in the White House, like you said, just like any other office, there's rumors milling about. When did you sort of start to see, hey, what is it? What's going on here? This might be a problem.
Well, uh, the best answer is the truthful answer, and that is that most of what I knew of what was going on that was happening 50 feet away regarding Watergate or other things I learned from the Washington
Yeah.
Post or from CBS News. Uh, because I wasn't hanging out with these guys. Exactly. However, there was a nervousness that people had. I remember, I don't want to use the name, but I remember in the East Wing, there was a woman one day talking about one of the guys who was involved in the scandal and that he was likely going to go to prison, and they were talking about the impact on his wife. The way that I saw it was more from the human standpoint of certain people were involved that other people knew, and how that actually affected their families. Than I ever saw anything that went on until the very end. And then at the very end, because I was a lounge lizard, I got to see certain events occur, like Goldwater
Yeah.
uh, and Rhodes, coming over to tell Nixon the game was over. But I'll tell you what from my standpoint, as a citizen, when you'd hear a conversation and people couldn't wait to get the Washington Post in the morning, you knew that there was a problem. Because there were at that point, to the best of my recollection, there was almost a story a day, a new story, and of some sort. And yeah, the Washington population ate it up. It was obviously one hell of a story. But you could see inside, and as it got closer to the end, when it became pretty clear that something not good was going to happen with the Nixon presidency, you started seeing a lot of people, or talk about a lot of people who were drinking early, and let's see, what was it in those days? Valium, which like a form of Xanax today. I mean, they were just like anybody else. Their nerves were shot, and they had no way to control any of it. But most of what I learned was from the papers, from Walter Cronkite, and also from what my professors would say to me that was nasty. Sometimes they bring up something I didn't know or hadn't paid attention to. But I think that it's like most things. It goes along at a certain pace, and then all of a sudden it just falls apart, and that's what happened with President Nixon.
It happens very slowly, then all at once.
Right. There was an episode that most people don't know about, that is very interesting, particularly in light of constitutional issues these days. Is that when the Supreme Court got the issue of on the Nixon tapes, I remember a friend of mine who worked on the Hill was up there, and he waited out in front for them to read the decision, and called me as soon the minute that he could. That was issued, and forgive me because I'm going to have the time off, but it was issued at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and Nixon was in the Western White House in California. And he sat on his decision for hours until what may have been 7 o'clock Eastern time, something like that. Because, at least I have read stories and heard people say that there was a discussion of whether he would obey the court or he would tell them to go pound sand. And as a lawyer, and as a guy who was a statesman, he realized he couldn't do that. But he did think about it, apparently. One other interesting thing with Watergate, sort of on the side, is that for a while, a long time ago, I did some things and had conversations with people at the Nixon Library. And one of the things that I was told that when they built the library, that Nixon insisted that the largest single exhibit, I think this is true, was to be about Watergate.
Really?
There was no shoving it under the rug. Yeah. And I always found that very interesting. Do you remember reading about the speech that he gave at Oxford?
No.
To the student union? You would enjoy that because one of the students asked him, basically, it was, you screwed up, didn't you? And President Nixon, former president at that time, swallowed hard and basically said, yeah, I did. Just a few words spoke volumes. But it was interesting that he wanted that Watergate brought out into the open. So
wow.
I've never been to the library, but that's what I understand.
I mean, he clearly screwed up in one sense or another. But ultimately he was forced to resign, or else he certainly would have been impeached. Like you mentioned, Goldwater. Why am I blanking on his name? Goldwater came and met with him and said, look, Mr. President, you have no support in the Senate on the impeachment trials. Like you're going to get impeached. And so he really had no choice. He did screw up. But do you think Nixon thinks he's innocent? Did he die thinking he was innocent, or do you think he thought he was guilty?
I think he was very much a realist. I think he did a pretty good job of trying to rehabilitate his image later on. But I think he knew. I don't think that there's a lot of question about that. But he at least in my mind. But he did some great things post presidency. One of Bill Clinton's best friends became Richard Nixon.
Really?
They used to talk all the time, apparently, um, because that was a resource. There was one, and Nixon was it.
Yeah.
And he was the best resource that you could possibly go to. But I think he
Yep.
was.
The best resource. Yeah, the best resource he could go to for political scandals for sure, which Bill Clinton was very aware of. Um, but yeah, I mean, I have these Nixon memoirs here. Hopefully, I can find answers within those pages on that question. But I mean, I had like you noted, I had Jeff Shepard on the podcast a while ago who worked on the Nixon defense team for Watergate, has spent his life researching this stuff, and he his point of view is that you know the Watergate prosecutions were a very bitter partisan thing. They were politically motivated to find whatever they could in order to frame him. It was sort of uh I'm no law nerd or lawyer, but you're supposed to find the evidence and then determine if they're guilty, not determine they're guilty and then sort of try to find evidence to support that, which he makes the case that the prosecutors did. And he was actually the one who named the smoking gun tape the smoking gun, which was ultimately the thing that really brought him down. But he says now, years later, that the smoking gun tape has been misinterpreted and misunderstood even by himself at the time, and that he was actually he was trying to protect the identities of two Democratic donors, not trying to cover it up. But I mean, it's really interesting. I think Watergate. There's more to the story on Watergate. I think, especially the media at the time, just really took it and ran, and it was so politically popular to be against Nixon after Watergate broke that I do think Watergate deserves to be reexamined.
Well, I would tell you this: Mr. Shepard and I've never met him. I read part of one of his books, um, but he and I would significantly disagree.
Hmm.
Um, I, if there was anything that everything starts with certain inclinations, certain opinions.
For sure.
But when you got down to the end and you were watching it, uh, you saw that one would see that it was not partisan. I got to know Larry Hogan, Howard Baker. You'll remember Hogan, gave a speech in the Judiciary Committee about, my president should have said, "Go away," don't discuss these things in front of me. But my president didn't. And Larry was a very staunch, long-term Republican. I think, except for there were a couple of guys. There was one guy from Orange County, California, where that's a very radically conservative kind of neighborhood out there. But most everybody on the Judiciary Committee had given out. Have you ever heard Barbara Jordan's speech?
No, I have not.
Listen to that. Oh, actually, you can read it in my book. I have most of the speech in that book.
Oh, well, then I definitely did read it.
It will give you chills.
Oh yeah, this I do remember. I'm reading about this, but I don't exactly recall what she said. Please do tell.
Well, first of all, she had this marvelous voice, and she spoke about the Constitution, and she spoke about how when the Constitution was written that she was not part of it, but she talked about the sanctity of the Constitution, and that that the president had violated the sanctity of that document. It was so stirring. I remember watching it with some friends. Watching it was on in the evening. They used to. You didn't have a lot of live coverage of it. They replay it at night on PBS, and I think that each one of the networks took turns. And I remember watching it with some of my friends, and one of them saying, "There's no." After listening to Barbara Jordan, it was over. There was no way to get out of that. No way.
Yeah.
So um, she's a Democrat from Texas, but there were some very partisan things that went on, and it just depends on your point of view.
Yeah.
Agnew, which you may not know, asked Carl Albert, who was the Speaker of the House, to when all of the stuff came up on the bribery, he asked that it go to the Judiciary Committee for them to either vote up or down a bill of impeachment, and Albert refused.
Hmm.
Um, that was political because they clearly did not want. Um, if Agnew was cleared, they didn't want him sitting there, and Nixon resigned, sitting there as an incumbent in 1976. So I mean, there were some things that were just very, very clear, but I don't think that one was. I really don't.
Hmm.
Well, that's good for a debate some other time.
Yeah, it does make for interesting debate, but nevertheless, Nixon resigns, and gives a very famous farewell address in the East Room of the White House. That was one of the things when I was there in the East Room. I was like, wow, Nixon gave his farewell address to his staffers here. Jeff Shepard was there. You were also there. What was it being like in the East Room? What was the mood? And what did you think of what he said?
Well, besides it being miserably hot, um, it people were jammed in there, and I was in the back. Um, in fact, I'm in some old films of that, and I pointed myself out to my children one time, and their remark was, "Dad, you could have never been that young." After the Nixons had departed, it may have been I don't know anymore. 3 4 hours, maybe a little bit more than that. At some point, I was back. I was over in the West Wing doing something, and what I saw was that the pictures of President Nixon in the along the walls of the West Wing had been taken down. The photographs. You may have seen them whenever you went on a tour, if you went in the West Wing,
Mhm.
and they've been there. That's been a staple for a long period of time. They were down, and there were pictures of President Ford, and people were working. People were setting up meetings for Monday. They were doing all of the normal kinds of things that they would do. And what impressed me was the United States did not skip a beat. We changed leaders. We did it with dignity. We changed leaders, and we just continued the work. And it was very clear, and it was very clean.
Yeah, I do. That's a great point. I think that's a very important aspect of all of this. Is even in times of incredible uncertainty and controversy and chaos, U.S. Has that ability, that resilient ability to remain strong and carry on no matter what the threat. I mean, we had a little bit of a civil war at one point, but we came out on the other side, and if we can do, if we can last that, if we can weather that storm, I feel very confident in the structure that our founders uh, created. But moving to Ford, who we both agreed earlier was a great man, possibly sort of a forgotten president from history. Lost the election to Carter, but he deserves a lot of credit. Um, Arguably one of the most important decisions in American history to restore faith in the government. We talked about the credibility gap with Johnson and the Vietnam War, and that credibility gap only got way worse after Watergate. I mean, I'd 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 love to see a poll taken in '75. '75 was the year he resigned, taken in '75 after he resigned about trust in the US government, because I bet it was horrendous numbers. But Nixon, or not Nixon, Ford makes probably the politically unpopular choice, um, to pardon Nixon, despite probably a lot of pressure to do the contrary and let this thing play out. But he pardons Nixon. What did you think of that decision, and what was your observations about the rest of the American public in terms of that decision?
Well, as a very young man, and I thought it was a very good decision. And looking back on it, I still think it was a good decision. There are a lot of people who want to argue that now, um, uh, but President Ford was not able to make a decision based on a crystal ball of what might occur in the future. He had what he had in front of him at the time, and you know, to a, when you have lived through that time when it was constant tumult, and I really can't overstate when I made the comment about people couldn't wait to get the Washington Post in the morning. It was part it, it was part criminal investigation and part carnival. Um,
Yeah.
I I I was very fortunate to speak to a wonderful, amazing group of people a couple of years ago in DC about the book, and they were with some very amazing people there, including a guy that helped to forge the SALT agreements, a woman who had worked for Queen Elizabeth. I mean, they were wild, incredible group of people. One of the folks in the group said was, "I never wanted it to end." He said it was the greatest show in town, and you know, but it was, and it was a relief to have it over with. And I wrote in the book, and from my perspective, the moment you know when we all went back into the East Room, I snuck in. I had to sneak in everywhere, but and Ford took the oath of office. You felt this cloud lift,
Mm.
and the air seemed lighter, and it was, we're back on track. We're not going to, have this, and we handled it with dignity. Um, but I don't think Ford had another decision. I don't think there was much of an option. I mean, inflation at that time was completely out of control.
Hmm.
You may read something about the win. I remember working on the win buttons thing. It was whip inflation now.
Huh.
They wanted to do victory gardens like they had in World War II, things like that. Um, and it went nowhere. And it just and inflation just got worse. People were unemployed. We had problems with gasoline supplies. You had more problems that you could shake a stick at. And I don't think he really had a choice.
Yeah.
He had off his desk one way or the other.
Mhm.
Took a lot of guts.
Yeah, that's true.
The approval ratings they went from being very high to through the floorboards overnight.
Exactly, that's why I say it was unpopular, but it was incredibly courageous and, the right decision. It's time for the country to move on from this whole Watergate thing. We have problems to take care of. Because if he didn't, can you imagine how long Watergate would have dragged out? How ugly it would have been for a US president, um, to be vilified like that, to possibly be incarcerated, um, or convicted. It just would have been ugly. It would have been an ugly stain on the prestigious office of the president. It was time to move on, made the right decision. But speaking of President Ford, your book to my dissatisfaction, ended on a cliffhanger. So I was
You're a lot of people.
I was waiting to be able to talk to you about this. It ends with you walking. You make eye contact with President Ford as he's standing in the Oval Office, and he waves you in, and you say, "Perhaps that's a story for another time." Well, I think this is that time.
Okay, I'll tell you. And by the way, I posted it. You can for any particular people who are interested, you can go to downstairs at the whitehouse.com and you'll find the story written. So here's the shortest version I can make of what happened. Again, I was a young guy, broke. I had one suit and maybe a sports coat and some slacks or whatever. And I was running all the time, back and forth. And I would take hot dogs. I'd buy them over the cafeteria and then, hold on to it and eat it as I could. So I always had kind of an aroma of beef. And one day I was down in the near the diplomatic reception room. And whoever it was who was in charge of walking Liberty, it was President Ford's dog, kind of let him a little loose, or she, as I recall, got loose and went right for my pocket. When she did, she not only ripped my jacket, but she ripped my pants. This is the only, that was it. I had this oyster poplin colored suit I had to wear all year long. You know what it's like to be a broke college student.
Yes.
So I just chalked it up to what the hell you going to do? And when I went back to the office in the East Wing, everybody was just laughing at me when I told them that story. Well, somehow that story got to the president.
Oh, wow.
Which can't imagine how it did. But I happened to be standing in front of the Oval Office, harassing one of the Executive Protective Service guards, this uniform Secret Service, who sat in front of the door to the Oval Office and the door was open when the president wasn't in there. And we're talking about some football game that's coming up. And all of a sudden, there's this commotion, and the guard lunges for the door to close it. President Ford walks in the back, and it was autumn, and there are, leaves blowing in and the whole thing. He came in the back of the Oval Office, and he looks at me, and then he points his finger like, come here. So this is one of those moments in life where you go, I don't know, what's my play here? Okay? Because he could have been pointing to someone else. I have been through the experience where, there's a pretty girl and she's waving and you think she's waving to you, but she's waving to the guy behind you. Okay? So I just decided I'll go for it. Like my dad said, they can't eat you, right? So I walked in, and the guard, I'm sure he must have turned, pale. But the president said to me, he goes, I understand my dog destroyed your pants. And I said, well, yes, sir. There was this incident and the whole thing. And whatever he handed me, now I had it in my notes, maybe it was $20, which was a lot of money in 1974. And he said, I want you to go replace them. And he handed me the money. Okay, well, now you'd think that's where it ends, right? Except for that klutzy part of me that was kind of overcome at the moment. I turn around and now I can't find my way out. And here's why.
Yep.
Because when he closed the doors in the Oval Office are meant to go completely flush,
Yeah.
and you can't see. And on that particular door, the I think it was, again, you have to read the thing I wrote. That the doorknob was flushed into the door, and I couldn't see it because the guard had pulled it shut because the president was in there. And so I finally had to kind of lift around. The president finally went, "Oh, it's that door." And I opened it, it went through. So that's the big cliffhanger. But he was so kind and so nice a man, that everybody there. I don't know. I mean, there were people in the House staff that were civil servants, uh, who had been there since, at least, most of them Truman. I remember there was one guy who would walk around rubbing his hands towards the end of Watergate and going, "Oh, what a wicked web we weave when first we conspire to deceive." Um, and But you never heard anything like that, anything nasty about President Ford. Never. Um, there were women that worked there when Mrs. Ford had breast cancer and had a double mastectomy at Bethesda Hospital, he flew in a driving rainstorm in Marine One to be there with her when she woke up from surgery. And I remember women there standing and going, "That's the kind of guy I want to marry one day." But he's just a class act.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a class act. So, but then so was the guy following him. So,
That's so amazing.
America was lucky.
Yeah.
Um, but I ended up having another brief conversation with, again, I wasn't talking policy.
Right.
And I remember they had a picnic. They threw a picnic for the entire staff. And all I could think about was food. And I'm heading out there to this thing, and I run into him. And he looked at me, and I looked at him. And all I could think of to say was, "So, how do you like being president?" And he said, "Yeah, pretty good job. It's all right." And he said, "How do you like your job?" I said, "It's all right." And so we went our separate ways. He went to run the free world, and I went to get a hot dog and some potato salad.
That's so amazing. I think that's a hallmark of a great leader is to be able to have that know your audience, like to have that rapport with everybody and anybody who's working with you. I mean, as a young kid working in the White House, that must have meant the world to you to have the president of the United States be so warm and friendly and cordial and kind of meet you at your level. He doesn't bark orders at you or drop some crazy policy, question on you. He's like, you're a guy and he's a guy and you guys are just chopping it up.
I mean, I don't think they have those jobs anymore. The one that I had, and because we have email and text, and nobody, you don't have to carry pieces of paper. But it just led to lots of kinds of things that you would run into. The one that would yell at me was General Hay.
Oh yeah.
He understood that I actually worked for the White House. He thought he'd always think I worked for someone else, which I found was disturbing. But in fact, the night that Senator Scott and Senator Goldwater and John Rhodes had gone over to tell Nixon that the jig was up, no, I can't remember what I was going to say, but they were wonderful people.
Yeah.
By and large, and very nice, and I was very lucky to be there.
I wanna ask you about what was probably the most exciting part of the book to me. because I too obviously share your sentiment and appreciation of American history. So, when you were working in the White House one day, you received some mail, and it was an unmarked book, an old unmarked book. What was that book?
That was one of the most extraordinary things I ever saw in my life for a
I cannot
variety of reasons.
I
So,
cannot imagine.
so what happened is I get they used to have these inter-office envelopes, and it had come from the West Wing with my name on it. And why, I have no idea why they would send it to me. But somebody over there must have thought, well, he's a college kid. He'll like this or whatever. I don't know. So there's this envelope in or a postal service envelope that just had stamps on it. It had a return address, as I recall, but it just said the President, the White House, Washington. And there was a little note inside that said, "You'll see who's signed this book over the years, and I would be honored if you would sign it and send it back." I got to tell you, I opened it up, and it was almost in chronological order, almost going back to John Adams. It was like an autograph book, and it was on lined paper that had been roughly assembled. And I mean, you're sitting there and looking at Abraham Lincoln's signature and JFK and Kit Carson. I mean, Davy Crockett. I mean, it was beyond belief. So, of course, what I wanted to do was just say, I don't know who this is. I'll take it home. But thinking better of it, I took it over to President Ford's secretary, and I said, this thing came in the mail. And I mean, I still look back and go, if you had that in your possession, would you mail it? I wouldn't. I'd have guards take it somewhere. And it was for President Ford's signature. But it was unbelievable. So I ended up doing some research later on. I don't know what happened to it after that. I'm sure the president signed it and they mailed it back. But I did some research on it to find out that there was a trade that people had with some of the doormen at the White House and some of the guys from the stables. Is that what they would do? Is if a messenger rode a horse from the White House up to Capitol Hill, he would collect autographs, and then he'd bring them back to the White House, and somebody would pay him for them. They take them and cut them up, or they do one thing or another, and then they would and they would sell them. So they were even selling autographs back in those days. And that probably what happened is that this was a book, and somebody was just given the book and go get this signature. But so if David Crockett was a member of Congress, they went and got Davy Crockett's signature, and so very, very unusual, very interesting piece.
That's got to be the coolest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, it was. And I ran into a guy one time in an airport who was a autograph dealer, and I was telling him about this. And the first question he had is, "Where is it?" And I said, "I have no idea. It was a long time ago." I said, "What would it be worth?" And he said, he goes, "It's almost incalculable." At least that was his opinion at the time, depending on the state it was in and everything else. But he goes, if it was almost in chronological order, that's unbelievable. So somebody's got it out there.
Well, hopefully, it would be amazing if that person was watching this right now and they were to reach out.
That's right. But somebody had it. There was something that I researched about a family that did some of those things. Very interesting piece. Remarkable.
I mean, all the way back to John Adams. That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it was it.
the things that that book has seen, that's been and I mean, the preservation to keep it around. I mean, mail just throwing it in the mail and trusting that it would get to the White House and back.
Well, that's incredible. The other thing is that some of the signatures were looked like they had been signed that day, which of course that had not happened. They weren't whatever ink they used.
Hmm,
Um, it made it look very new, and some of them were very old and faded, and it just kind of depended. And it wasn't really the binding was somewhat very unusual kind of binding that they used at that time, sometime in the 1800s. Uh, but yeah, it was remarkable, very remarkable.
that is right. I hope it's just for the sake of being a history buff. I hope it's at least out there and safe and still alive. Who knows? Maybe it's even still being sent to the White House. Being um, I want to talk about the city of Washington actually, because it is a goal of mine, a dream of mine to move there, to live there at some point. It's a beautiful city. I mean, I've been there multiple times now. It's got to be probably my favorite place on earth. Just the history, the symbolism of it all. Um, but if you were to look at the city through sort of a political lens, to anybody who wants to move there or pursue a career there, um, what are some of the most important lessons you would say you've learned from, or most important takeaways you say you've learned from being in at the center of power, being in Washington D.C., how that city operates?
How it operates. Well, it was John Kennedy who said that it was a city of northern efficiency and southern charm, and it probably was when he said that. Uh, Now it is part of the megalopolis, and it is. I found it. I left there in 2006. Um, it was a difficult place to live and very expensive. The metro area is massive. Um, they had a joke about for years in 1968 they built Dulles Airport, and I remember flying out of there at once back in the 70s, and it was out in the middle of a field. But the people who did the planning said this area will be, it'll be highly congested within 30 or 40 years, and they were right. And the I mean, I had a couple of different lifetimes through Washington, and each time it got to be a little bit more expensive and more difficult.
Yeah.
Um, my son is an actor, and he lives in Washington. He loves it because um, he he can get anywhere he wants to go, whether it's for work or fun, on the metro. And that was a great thing. I tragically am old enough to remember when it was being built, but he finds it easy to get around. But he's obviously a lot younger and he's got more patience.
Yeah.
But you probably, unless you can, I think you have one of two choices from some of our younger friends that we know. These days, it's get like 5 roommates
Yeah.
and find a place on the hill, which is probably what I would do um, if I could go back
Hmm.
um, all those years. Or you go to places like Tacoma Park. Some people live way out in Beltsville, which these are ex are urban and almost semi ex-urban communities.
Hmm.
Um, but I'll tell you this much: it'll keep you on your toes. You'll meet any kind of person you ever wanted to meet. You'll meet
Yeah.
somewhere there, and good and bad. And yeah, the best benefit about it is the stuff that's free, which is damn near everything that you really want to do.
Yeah, that's so true.
I know he enjoys the art music. He's a big history fan and also works does a lot of work at Ford's Theater. Um, but you cannot go wrong as a history uh, buff being there.
Yeah.
You just bear in mind the same thing I try to remember when I'm in England or Scotland is that you're walking on pavement that has been walked on by some of the greatest and some of the most infamous names in history.
Yeah.
And it's that's pretty heavy, but um, it's fun. Be prepared to be more broke
Mm-hmm.
uh, living there.
Yeah. So make it as affordable as possible, pretty much. But I mean, it is a beautiful city. But for someone, I know your time was relatively brief, couple years in the political arena in DC. But are there any lessons that you would have on the game of politics in DC?
Well, um, yeah, but I think that these apply to anything, which is good.
That's
Um, Never snub anyone because you don't know who they may be or who they may be connected to. And I saw people do that and pay for it.
mm,
The
that's good.
While take risks. I mean, I got to know Goldwater and Hugh Scott because I got on the senator's elevator. Uh, because I traded a guy some matches and I got a ride and I ended up knowing them for quite a while.
That is,
You don't know who you're going to meet, and the more things that you can get involved with, that are, and this may sound a little odd, but they're kind of outside of politics, but within the same realm. So it's not like, young Republicans or young Democrats, but there may be some other organizations that are geared towards international relations.
right.
Because it'll help you build a network of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the and very interesting people. I mean, this sounds. I don't think probably I'd have to suggest this, but hang out in some of the bars on Capitol Hill.
Oh, for sure.
Because that's where everybody goes.
Yeah.
And the and I guess the other thing I would say is listen a lot.
Yeah.
There are always people, old people like me that are always looking for an audience, but there are people who, they'll start talking about. I can't count the number of times that I just sat with somebody and they started on a conversation on a topic I wasn't familiar with, ended up becoming friends, and at some point down the road later on, you do business with them, you have some kind of relationship with them that is very surprising. And it's from all different industries. I'll tell you one group I would go and hang out with to learn about it are lobbyists.
Yeah.
And go to the bar at the
Old Ebbitt.
Yeah, you go to the Old Ebbitt and hang out at the park.
I've been
yeah,
there.
okay. So hang out there, and then go to the. Oh God, I hate when my memory fails. The one on Pennsylvania. I'm talking to my supervisor, my wife. It's right on Pennsylvania Avenue.
I think
It's huh?
I think it closed.
No, we were there. I'll send you the name. But
Okay.
it's got this incredible bar in it, and you'll meet a ton of people, White House and congressional and lobbyists and people. Go down to Foggy Bottom, which is a stop on the metro. Get off. It's down near GW, but the State Department's down there. And
Oh,
go hang out with those people. Plot out the different areas where these people are going to be.
yeah.
I remember once having just this really long, fascinating conversation. I mean, decades and decades ago, it was somebody who worked for the National Institutes of Health. Yeah, you just meet them in a bar,
Yeah.
and so you'll have plenty of opportunities, my friend. But you plot it out that way because people they tend to party close to where they work.
Hmm. Yeah, it goes back to what you're saying. I mean, seize every opportunity that comes your way. And I can't think of a place that's filled with more opportunity and possibility than DC, especially if you're historically or politically inclined. Um, I have an interesting, funner question for you to finish us off. You're a history buff yourself. So if you could have dinner or hang out with any three historical figures from history, any people from history, who would you want to talk to?
Probably, wow. American history?
Anybody.
Anybody. Well, all right. If it's anybody, I'd pick James the Fourth of Scotland because he was he was probably the most successful of the Stuart kings who ruled Britain for Scotland and then Britain for 300 years.
Yeah.
Um, he was very much a Renaissance man. I think he would be fascinating. Um, Winston Churchill,
Great pick.
if I could keep up with him,
Yeah, I know.
because his mind was said to be incredibly fast. And probably the other one would be, I probably everybody's favorite, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Just to have a real sense of the man, which I felt I got from Daniel Day-Lewis in the Lincoln movie,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure because he was both a savior, but he was also a conniver. He was a politician, and it would be very interesting to hear his take on how he accomplished what he did. So I'd pick those three.
That's very true.
And then one day later on, I'll pick you.
All right. Well, hopefully I'll have enough experiences by the end of my life to have an interesting story to tell. But yeah, those are great picks. I think Churchill might be on my list. And to Daniel Day-Lewis, Doris Kearns Goodwin, it was her book that the movie was based off of, and she got to hang out with Daniel Day-Lewis, beforehand and afterwards, and she says, I mean, it's her book, and she says he became Lincoln. He absolutely nailed it.
Well, Jay, I want to tell you this. You're very well read. You're extremely well spoken. When you took a break for a moment and my wife, who's sitting right over here, said, he's very smart. And I said, yes, indeed, he is. So you've got all those things working for you, my friend.
Well, I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I'm just trying to do the best I can, We'll
So
see.
you'll succeed.
Hopefully we'll
I think you're a good bet. You're a good bet. There are a lot of people I would not say that about, but you're a very good bet. You'll be doing you'll find interesting, and you'll be able to look back on your life and go, "Wow, I got to do all those things," and you'll see weird stuff and interesting things too. So
I hope so. I hope I do get to see a lot of weird stuff because it's the weird stuff that makes life interesting.
So I wrote another book, and I would like you to read it, and then call me sometime. It's called Rooksby, Urgent Warning. And then I'm going to write another one, which is going to be the last one I'm going to write probably, which is about this whole lifetime I've had that has been one weird experience after the next.
Oh, that's amazing. That's going to be a fantastic book. But Don, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. Telling these amazing stories.
Hey, and please tell your listeners it's available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle.
Yeah, I'll have it linked down in the description for sure.
Oh, great. Well, we have 1,600 reviews and people seem to like us because they laugh a lot. So,
yes. And it sells enough for you to not buy a pineapple on your pizza.
You got it, buddy. Although I'll rethink that since you said that.
Yes, please do.